Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening at our Histories Online series. This talk is held in conjunction with the National Library's exhibition, Human Nature, Environmental Histories of Singapore. This exhibition traces the history of Singapore's natural environment and how our present-day relationship with it is shaped by this legacy. The exhibition is now on until 26 September 2021 at the National Library Building. This evening's topic is, Where is Singapore? Recollecting the Natural History of an Island. Our speaker is Martyn Low, a research associate at the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum. He has co-edited and contributed to several publications for the museum, including last year's 50 Stories of Labor and Love, and in 2019, 200 Points in Singapore's Natural History, as well as Voyageurs, Explorateurs, et Scientifiques, the French and Natural History in Singapore. He has also published articles on crustaceans, mollusks, birds, mammals, amphibians, and reptiles. I will now pass on the session to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us today, despite it being the first evening of dining out. Thank you very much, and it is indeed a privilege to be able to spend this evening with you, talking about some of the interesting stories of Singapore's natural history. Two overarching themes, I think, in particular, that I would like to explore, and that I'm interested in personally from a research point of view, are those of collectors and Vestigia, or I like to use the term Vestigia. Collectors I use in the broadest possible sense to include specimen collectors. This will be people who have collected plants, animals, and other natural history materials. I also consider, in many ways, artists, illustrators, drawers, photographers, draftsmen to also be collectors, because they captured, perhaps not in a physical, tangible sense, in the same way of that a specimen or an artifact is, but they did capture that point or that snapshot in Singapore's past. Other collectors are also can include log keepers who kept ships' logs as they were sailing through Singapore's waters, and other data collectors, as well as all the writers and the authors who have come to Singapore, visited Singapore, resided in Singapore, and written down their experiences. The second idea is that of Vestigia. Some of you may have read this fictional series called The Rivers of London. There is this idea of Vestigia. So the dictionary defines Vestigia as a vestige or a trace, a mark or indication left by something that has been destroyed, that's lost or no longer present, which I think in many ways takes us back to what I just said about photographers and illustrators, for example, because many of the things that they drew are no longer with us. So what I would like to do this evening is actually to, in that sense, recollect what they have collected, these remnants of Singapore's past through their collectors. So on the right here, you will see the entrance to the Human Nature exhibition, which I don't know how many of you have visited. You may want to give an indication of whether you visited and what you thought of it. But I would strongly encourage you to visit the exhibition, and I congratulate the curators and the team on that. So we start off with people who are not directly connected to Singapore, and this is in the 1700s. There was a man called Joseph Banks who sailed with James Cook around the world on the Endeavour, in some ways marking the period of scientific discovery, of the European scientific discovery of the world. Following his voyage, he had the idea of transporting breadfruit, which he had encountered and eaten in Tahiti, to the West Indies. The West Indies at this time, of course, were where African slaves were working on plantations. And the idea was that the breadfruit would actually serve as a form of food for these slaves. Joseph Banks had the ear of the king, managed to get the king to give him a ship to sail to Tahiti to collect the breadfruit plants. And Joseph Banks agreed that Captain William Bligh would be in charge of the ship, and the first expedition sailed. It was aboard HMS Bounty. That didn't turn out very well, because after they had collected the seedlings, the men mutinied for various reasons, and it's gone down in the annals of history for its infamy. And Bligh was basically shoved into the ship's launch and set adrift with some of his loyal men. Bligh managed to make it back to England. He was acquitted. He was court-martialed but acquitted, and given command of a second breadfruit expedition aboard HMS Providence. And aboard HMS Providence was also a man called Christopher Smith, who was an Irish botanist who was appointed at Joseph Banks' recommendation to be a plant collector. on the Providence. So here we have a painting of the collection of the seedlings in Tahiti. We have King II, William Bligh, who is in his uniform. And it has been suggested by a historian that one of these two men could be Christopher Smith. With the conclusion of the breadfruit business successfully, Christopher Smith was appointed as superintendent of the Botanic Gardens in Calcutta at Banks's recommendation. So Banks was becoming something of Smith's patron. Unfortunately, Smith was delayed in England, and by the time he sailed out to Calcutta, William Roxburgh had already taken over as superintendent, and Smith was instead given the consolation prize of nurseryman. Understandably, Smith was very upset and unhappy with his situation, and in order to try to advance his career despite this setback, when he heard of a naval squadron sailing to the Spice Islands, which are today the Maluku Islands, he thought it would be a good opportunity to sail to the Spice Islands and collect plants there for Joseph Banks. So he planned to rendezvous with the squadron at the Prince of Wales Islands, which is today Penang, and he had hoped to collect cloves and nutmeg and other plants at the Spice Islands. But he missed the boat. Literally, he missed the boat by 6 days. So he arrived in Penang 6 days too late. But instead of sulking, and crying in a corner, he took the opportunity to collect up and down the Straits of Malacca, and he went as far south as Barn Island. This on the right is actually a navigational aid that was used by sailors in the past. So they are actually the outlines of islands from the sea, as viewed from the sea, that were used as waypoints when you were navigating. So you can imagine, in some ways you hear electronic synthesizer voice in the background saying, when you approach Barn Island from this direction at this latitude, turn right, and then continue sailing so many hundreds nautical miles. So in many ways, the navigational aids that were available back then are still with us, just in a different form. So Smith collected 7 specimens of plants at Barn Island in June and July 1796. 5 are in the Linnean Society in London. These are the examples of them. And 2 of them are in the Natural History Museum in London. The significance of these plants in many ways cannot be overstated because they are the oldest extant natural history material from Singapore that is known, because they were collected in 1796, which is more than 2 decades before Raffles and other naturalists visited Singapore. Today, of course, Barn Island is better known as Pulau Senang. You may ask, what is the point of plants that were collected, centuries ago? We just finished the bicentennial, so it's over 200 years now since Smith collected those plants. But what's the point of all these old drawings, old charts? If we put the 2 and 2 together, looking at the specimens to have an idea of what plants were present, and looking at some of the vignettes that were drawn and left behind by shipmen, showing the outlines of islands and some of the vegetation, we actually get an idea of what was there in the past. And so through what they have left behind, this Vestigia, we know what Barn Island may have looked like at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Thursday, the 17th of August, 1769, which was an entire half a century before Raffles. Another question that we could ask is, why Barn Island? Why did Christopher Smith stop at Barn Island? Why did he not sail further in, further west, further east? And a possible answer comes from 2 other relatively well-known people, John Crawford and Nathaniel Wallich. Wallich, of course, is famous for, in many ways, starting the first botanical gardens together with Raffles, and also for very overpriced property today. They were sailing on their voyage out of Singapore to India. They were sailing away from the town, and they came to this point, almost exactly where Christopher Smith was, almost 30 years before. And John Crawford recounts how it fell calm. The wind left their sails, and as their usual practice, they landed, and the island that they landed upon was called Alligator Island. It's quite likely that Wallich actually collected plants from here. Today, of course, Alligator Island is better known as Pulau Pawai. Because we have come so far in terms of our technology from those days, we often forget that in the past, we were very much at the mercy of the winds, the currents, tides. And we certainly were not as mobile in that sense. Our mobility, the technology that allowed us to be mobile was not as developed. If we put ourselves in their shoes and we try to get a better idea of the challenges that they face, what we would consider simple things like currents and winds and tides in the age of sail could have been actually a big hindrance to people who were trying to sail away or towards Singapore. So that could be one of the reasons why Christopher Smith ended up at Barn Island. So staying in this corner of Singapore, a little further in time, we actually have some of the earliest geological surveys that were collected by James Lowe. He visited most of the outlying islands in the Sampan, and he actually took samples, was able to work out the stratigraphy of the islands, as well as parts of the mainland. Building on this work, as well as work of his own, James Richardson Logan, who's famous both in India and Penang and Singapore, produced one of the earliest geological maps of Singapore. And this was an entire map for the entire island, as well as some of the areas, the surrounding areas. So again, we're staying in this corner of the island. We have the islands that were visited by Christopher Smith, the islands that were visited by Nathaniel Wallich and John Crawford. Logan, of course, was also able to work out the geological relationships between the islands and the mainland, and how the different, what we call today, formations actually cut through the islands in the various parts of Singapore. So that's also interesting in a way. Moving up a little more to the north, we have another island, but still staying in this corner. We have James Sinclair, who was curator, later keeper of the herbarium at the Botanic Gardens in Singapore. And he collected this specimen in 1948 from Pulau Damar Laut. He was very excited about his job because he collected these specimens shortly after joining the Botanic Gardens. We have that specimens from 1796 of Christopher Smith, and we have specimens of more plant specimens from a different time from nearby islands over almost 100 years later, collected by Sinclair. So it's a nice, in a way, a nice continuum. We have an idea of what plants were growing here. What about animals? Doris Geddes, who actually lived on Pulau Damar Laut, one day picked up a python that she thought was dead, and she recounts how she was actually trying to pose it for a photograph. And then she realized it was actually alive, and I'm sure there was quite a bit of excitement, but eventually the python was taken probably to the Raffles Museum, but we are not sure what happened to it. So, but now you have an idea that it wasn't just plants, but you have an idea of the animals that were found in this area. And again, this is one of those little bits of information that is in the news, one of the newspaper reports that is now, of course, easily accessible through Newspaper SG. We also have photographs of Pulau Damar Laut, because possibly Peter Geddes was possibly Doris's husband, but he actually took photos of the island and the surroundings. So we actually have both black and white photographs and colored photographs of the island, its surroundings, some of the ships and vessels and boats that were being used. So this adds to the story of this corner of Singapore. Of course, as I have titled this section, on the Eve of Reclamation, this was just before this entire corner of Singapore was developed. The group of islands further to the south, of course, is today Jurong Island. Pulau Damar Laut today is part of Jurong Port. So all these places and these habitats are gone. But we have what are this vestigia that's left, right? So that's one thing I keep returning to. We have this vestigia all over the place, in newspaper reports, in sailing charts, or even on Flickr for that matter. But it is possible to bring them back together again to a certain extent, to give us a better idea of what was going on in different parts of Singapore. So from this corner of Singapore, we move over to the other corner, which is diagonally opposite. And here we have, his nickname was Tuan Buaya, Lancelot Ambrose Scudamore Jamin. He was a school teacher and later principal at a school in Malacca. He was interned as a POW at Changi and later at Sime Road. He was an avid naturalist and a proponent of crocodile farming. That was the reason he got the nickname of Tuan Buaya, which translates as Sir Crocodile. While interned in the POW camp, Jamin took the opportunity to translate Virgil's Georgics. If you are a science kind of person, a zoologist, naturalist, you probably wouldn't be so interested in this. But in his preface to this book, or his translation, he actually talks about the animals and the plants that he observed just outside the camp. So he talks about birds that were flying around, and he even talks about this little chup-chupping lizard, which is probably a cicak or gecko, that would wish him good night before lights out. And again, judging by its title, this would not be a work that you would search for natural history, but it does contain Singapore's natural history. So snippets are everywhere. There was also quite a bit of clandestine ornithology and other fields of science that were going on in Changi. Guy Maddock was a policeman prior to the war. During imprisonment, he and several of his co-prisoners actually wrote an entire bird book. And this was done using a borrowed typewriter and borrowed sheets of paper. But it was quite a significant work. It was actually based on observations of the birds that they saw around Changi. And he was helped by Carl Alexander Gibson Hill, who later became a director of the Raffles Museum, as well as a medical doctor named David Molesworth. So Molesworth is credited with making the illustrations for the book. It's very obvious from this picture that it was typewritten and with inked drawings. This bird book that they produced, the first edition was a unique one-off because it was made with a typewriter. Today, it is in the possession of Murdoch's daughter, Fenella. And within the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum, we actually have exhibit that talks about this ornithology that went on behind the prison gates. It has a replica of the book, as well as other information on people like Murdoch and Gibson Hill. So these are ways in which we can try to use this rather interesting activities that went on during the war to show that there was natural history going on, and who were some of the people who were actually doing the natural history even during wartime. They are part of our what we call our heritage gallery in the museum. Another person who I cannot even find at the moment his first name is R.J. Spittle. He published his observations on the birds he saw at Changi after the war in the Bulletin of the Raffles Museum, and his article actually includes a map of Changi. And you can see that he has actually marked out the various parts of the camp. He has marked out where the mangroves were. And this is an excellent map for people who are interested in mangroves, for people who are interested in what that part of Changi used to look like. It's a fantastic resource. For people who are interested in World War II history, this would also be a very interesting map. What I think is more important is that such sources need to be brought to light. And those of us who are more interested in the sciences, in birds, for example, in natural history, we need to be able to talk more, to collaborate more with colleagues and researchers who are interested in other topics, including war history, because there is, as you can see from this, there is the possibility of cross-fertilization, and just to make each other aware of sources that we otherwise would not have come across in our daily work. Yeah. So again, one other person who was at Changi, his nickname was Changi Aspinall. So George Henry Aspinall was an Australian soldier. Before the war, well, they were based in Changi. He was always at Changi village, learning how to develop his photos and spending his time in a Photoshop, the original Photoshop. Because of that, in the evening, whenever the superior officers would come and ask where is Aspinall, his bunkmates would reply Changi, right? So that's how he got the nickname Changi Aspinall. George Aspinall managed to smuggle his camera before he was taken as a POW, and actually managed to take shots of his time in Changi. So this is well-known collection of photographs that actually shows the different parts of the Changi area. And this is actually during their internment. So we have 4 different photographs. There are lots more. Some of his photographs were actually used as evidence for war crimes, the war crimes trials after the war. On the right here, we actually have the vegetable garden at Selarang, and this was taken by Aspinall. If you go to Singapore's premier nocturnal zoological attraction, you would know that there are 2 halves. One half, you cannot roam on your own. You have to ride on a tram, and we have completed the tram ride, if you will. Now we will go to the individual exhibits. So it will be a little more random, seemingly, and we will look at just different collectors, a multitude of collectors, and what they've been up to in the past. So James Ricalton was a school teacher and a good friend of Thomas Alva Edison. The story goes that Edison one day asked Ricalton to help him search for the perfect bamboo fiber for his incandescent bulb. Edison was actually using bamboo fibers, this is quite clear from the close-up here, that were carbonized, that would actually serve as the filament for his bulbs. And in search of this perfect fiber, Ricalton actually visited Southeast and East Asia in 1888 and 1889. So when I came across this photograph saying that it was taken in the harbour of Singapore, and that's what the caption says, I was very excited because he was known as a photographer in addition to his hunt for the fibre. I was like, oh, this is a new view of Singapore. I was very excited, and it looks as if that could be the clock tower at the Victoria Concert Hall. So I was like very excited. Then there was a little doubt that started nagging. So I asked my good friend and collaborator at the National Museum, Daniel Tam, to consult. Actually, this very afternoon, we were trying to figure out where this photograph could have been taken from. So we thought maybe it was Mount Faber, maybe it was Sentosa. And then he managed to find this photograph that almost matches perfectly in terms of the foreground and the background. Just the ships in between are different. And lo and behold, it is not Singapore. Things like this happen, which is why it is important to constantly dig deeper and deeper. Right. So when you are able to actually zoom in on this view, it's very clear that that is not the Victoria Memorial Clock Tower. But Ricarlton nonetheless did come to Singapore. He did say that he collected bamboo fibers from the vicinity. And I think that is important. You may ask why. Because tungsten came along, which was used for bulb filaments. Today's light bulbs, as you will know when you go to that big Swedish furniture supplier, do not even have filaments. So why was the search for these bamboo fibers important? And I think it's important because it recalls a period or a time a century ago when there was a rush to collect gutta percha. So today, most people would not have heard of this material, but it was a latex collected from a tree that was used to insulate telegraph cables. And because of this, it was literally the latex that encircled the world. Singapore was a major export center of gutta percha. It was collected here before being sent back to England for manufacture. And the gutta percha tree almost went extinct in this part of the world because of the demand for the latex. And of course, the question is, does it still matter? We today use copper wires, fiber optics, really high-tech things. So why does the demand for natural materials still matter? And I would like to put it to you that it does, because even our greenest technologies still use natural materials, whether we like it or not. And in our rush to renewables, we are actually setting ourselves up for perhaps even bigger catastrophes than the gutta percha. So The Economist wrote an article on how the demand for balsa wood has grown, because balsa wood is actually used in the core of the wind turbine blades. As I said, as we rush towards renewables, it is actually creating a balsa bubble in the Amazon. Today's turbines, of course, have blades, individual blades of up to 100 meters. Even larger ones are planned, and they require tons of balsa wood. And where's the balsa wood going to come from, right? These are things that we will have to think about, because we are supposed to be headed towards a cleaner future, right? Post-carbon, post-fossil fuel future. And yet the problems of a century ago may still be with us, something to think about. Another interesting character, Edward Morse, very well known as American archaeologist and naturalist, and for his books on Japan. One of his books was called Japanese Homes. Tucked away somewhere inside there were two drawings of a Malay house. Again, after today's very exciting episode with that photo, I am going to be very careful when I read the caption to you and it says Singapore. But drawings of a Malay home or Malay house in Singapore, but we are more interested in the Mangosteen, of course. So in another book called Japan Day by Day, it's actually made up of his diary entries for his visits to Japan. Morse actually talks about eating a mangosteen in Yokohama, right, of all places. And he says, at a hotel in Yokohama, he had a peculiar fruit from Singapore, and it tasted very agreeable, and it was almost delicious. And why does this matter? Why does American eating a mangosteen in Yokohama in the 1800s or the late 1800s matter? It actually shows that plants were being moved around as food, not just to various locations, but to stranger locations. I mean, we are all aware of the Great Columbian Exchange, for example, of turkeys going from the New World to the Old World, sweet potatoes and chili and tomatoes. But in the 1800s, you had mangosteens being taken to Yokohama. This speaks of demand, for example, and histories of food and histories of consumption. Morse, of course, even ended that section by asking if it could be cultivated back home. So that is interesting. On the topic of food history is a Swiss horticulturist and botanist named Alfred Usteri, who observed a Chinese bean dairy along the Kallang River. And this probably alludes to tofu making concession. He made a nice sketch of it. I have not translated what all the different parts of this apparatus or this setup are, but he actually indicates what each part was actually doing. And it's interesting that he would also include the direction, the orientation of which the building was built. Perhaps, situating the building in this particular angle relative to north produces better tofu. This in itself is interesting because we know that people had to eat back in the early 1900s, but what were they eating? How was that food being produced? And again, you may ask, why does that matter? It matters because histories of food and consumption do matter, but they are notoriously hard to find precisely because they are so ordinary. When photographs cost a bomb to produce, and when words were actually expensive to print, you will be very careful with what you recorded. So you may talk about a python that you ate, for example, because it was very exotic. It would sell well in your book back home, but you will not talk about every other meal that you had. So, you may have the travelers saying that they ate a tiffin, but they may not always enumerate what they had in that tiffin. So illustrations and accounts of the everyday, few and far between in the past. In fact, it's actually easier to find a drawing of a menagerie race where British officers would actually raise their pets than it is to find a drawing of what lunch looked like, for example, from the same time. Historians in the future, of course, will have a very different and opposite problem, but it is their problem. But why does consumption and histories of consumption and food matter? It matters for a simple reason, giving the example of seafood. It matters because we are still in many ways hunting wild animals for food. I think that this was a topic of a recent workshop that was held in NUS and Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. But snapper and stingray are still wild caught, which means that essentially we are still hunting wild animals for food. The histories, the stories of how we got to this point, of how the recipes were developed around the foods, around the ingredients matter. And so, that little drawing of a tofu factory could actually have broader significance. One last pair of collectors, as it were. These were the Petersens, Marjorie and Elle. They sailed around the Pacific Ocean on the Stornaway. They spent several months in Singapore in the late 1960s. Over here on the left, we have Elle with their adopted cat named Changi, who they adopted while they were staying at Changi. Marjorie wrote an account of their voyage, and she took photographs to illustrate the account. Here, she actually shows how, rather than using other methods to remove shipworms, which are kind of mollusks that burrow into the hulls of ships, apparently in Kallang in the 60s, they would just cook them out by building a fire underneath the hull. But what I found interesting from Marjorie's account is actually this photograph that she made of the Stornaway at the Republic of Singapore Yacht Club, which is of course at the West Coast. And it actually shows 4 Chinese men in the water. And what they are doing is they are aligning the blocks of wood underneath the ship so that as the tide recedes and the ship is left dry on the blocks, the side of the ship can actually be cleaned and repainted. This, of course, very often requires people or divers to be in the water to ensure that everything goes smoothly. But why is this interesting? This is interesting because when people are in the water, interactions with marine animals can occur. In the 130 years or so between 1857 and 1987, there were over 90 reports of large sharks either being seen or being captured in Singapore's waters, from the Singapore harbour area all the way to Changi in the east. Strangely, nothing recorded from the West. There were at least 19 attacks on humans, and all but 2 of these were fatal. So the shark jaws that you see here are actually in our museum today. This was the notorious case of the tiger shark, which had human remains found in its stomach. And these are 4 other examples of sharks that were caught in Singapore's waters. Here we actually have the distribution in time of the sharks being caught or observed, as well as the attacks. And it's quite clear that in the 1920s to the 1940s, there were quite a constant stream of both sharks being caught and sharks killing people. Perhaps we could ask why. There were Malay divers. So the Malay divers on Pulau Brani were particularly well known for their abilities. They would dive to repair ships, as Marjorie photographed. They would dive to retrieve lost items of baggage, for example, when passengers of cruise ships drop something in the water. There was also this rather today unsavory activity of coin diving, where passengers on cruise ships would actually throw coins into the water. As you can see from the screen grabs below, they would call them diving boys. they would actually dive after the coins as an amusement for the tourists. And this was when a lot of the attacks would actually happen. Some of the people who were killed by sharks were also fishermen. And then there were one or two people who were having a leisure swim who were also attacked. The question is, why were these attacks, concentrated in the 1920s and 1940s? I do not have the answers. This is just something that I came across quite recently, and all this data actually came from all newspaper reports. But there was certainly an increased amount of shipping in the harbor, and some of these ships would actually try to bait sharks, both for amusement as well as to catch them for food. This could actually have lured sharks into the harbor, but could there have been other reasons? Anecdotally, when this lady named Doris Boyer Smith was killed in 1925, a doctor actually recounted in the newspaper that a shark catcher named Ganti actually had a prophecy that one day a shark would kill a white man or white woman and a paga or fence would be built. He was specifically referring to the area where the Singapore Swimming Club is, which is where Boyer Smith was killed. And for the longest time, there was not a paga around the swimming club. But after her unfortunate death, a paga was built. Why wasn't a paga built before then? There were several other swimming areas around Singapore that had pagas around them, a potential lead for somebody who wants to dig deeper into this. Another story was recounted by Milan, who was 80 in 1941 when he was interviewed. And he recounted how a pilgrim on his way to Mecca actually dropped a steel box into the water and asked divers for help. But one of the divers kept the box and they did not return the box to the owner. The owner cursed the waters around Singapore. And from then on, the shark attacks started to happen. Is there any truth in that? Another incident that happened that was reported upon was how a shark was actually destroying fishing nets off Pasir Panjang in 1960, and the fishermen actually held a prayer ceremony where they burned 12,000 joss sticks and threw live chickens into the water. So there are all these, in addition to the medical part of it, people being killed by sharks, and the natural history part of it, what species these were, what can the sizes of the sharks that were being caught tell us about their ecology. You also have all these oral histories and human histories of shark attacks and their broader significance to humans in terms of religious aspects, cultural aspects, right? So certainly a wealth of research materials here. Again, back to this graph, all the data except for the first one in 1857 actually came from newspaper SG, so from all newspaper reports. I would like to give you a preview of a news recent source that I came across, and this 1857 observation actually came from a travel account written by Peter Laurie. He worked for Jardine Matheson, and he wrote a travel log, but it was for private circulation, so it was probably a very limited print run. WorldCat only lists about 8 other copies, but NUS Libraries has obtained a copy, which they will soon put online. And in his travel log, Laurie actually talks about how they would actually amuse themselves by baiting hooks and trying to catch the sharks, which they did. It's possible that this account took place in Singapore's harbour, which would mean that this is one of the earliest references to large sharks in the harbour in Singapore. Laurie was something of a poet, and he wrote this ditty about jellyfish, the Portuguese men of war. When off a far distant shore, we talked of Portuguese men of war, but now let's use that term no more and name them after Singapore. So he actually observed jellyfish in Singapore waters, and that's interesting. So another early observation of jellyfish in the Singapore Straits. And you may ask, why does it matter? Why does somebody had to say about jellyfish in the Singapore Straits over 100 years ago still matter today? It matters because jellyfish are still with us, and we are still interacting with them on various levels. Why do accounts of shark attacks matter, or interactions with sharks? And why do they still matter? Because we are still interacting with large fish. I think this is something that, as we head to a future in which humans and animals will interact more and more, because in many ways, the measures that have been taken to safeguard nature are working very well. Animals are reproducing, they feel safe enough to often go about their daily activities, like a python coiling itself around a railing, despite it being in close proximity to humans. But what does it mean? And what can the past tell us about how we can treat the animals and plants better in the years ahead? because we share this habitat with them, right? This island that we live on, it's not very big, but we share it with a whole host of other animals. But what can the past tell us about how we can better live with them? How can we be better stewards of this shared home? And to summarize, I hope I have been able to put across today is this idea of recollecting Singapore, that there is so much of Singapore in the past. If we imagine this to be the sum total of everything that was in Singapore once upon a time, all the animals, all the plants, all the data, if you will, that was floating around. All of these in many ways have been collected. This Vestigia, they're no longer with us. A lot of the places have been developed, they have been reclaimed. But we have bits and pieces, Vestigia, right, that are all over the place. They could be in travel logs like Laurie's book, for example. They could be in ship logs. They could be in photographs in funny places, or drawings of houses in funny places, accounts of mangosteens in funny places. And so, Singapore in many ways has been collected, and it has gone around the world. The orange lines point to the natural history depositories around the world where Singapore material resides or is known to reside. And truly, Singapore has gone around the world. So where has Singapore gone? Everywhere. But moving forward, what are some of the things that we can do that will be profitable towards gaining a better and richer history of Singapore? It would be to recollect these collections and to put it in a form that is usable not just by scientists and researchers, but by everybody. So that is hopefully illustrates what I'm trying to say about recollecting Singapore. Human Nature, the exhibition, please visit it and taking some inspiration from them. Why not multidisciplinary studies, the past and the future, and different aspects of science, different fields of science and research, and nature and history. So thank you very much.